Hello, everyone. I trust you are all well. This will be another and hopefully the final little addition that final addition to our bylaws series where we talk about some of the things that we want to see as far as changes are concerned. In our last meeting, there were some questions that came up. I thought they were very good questions. I wanted to address them. And subsequent to that, we met with the church leadership, and we actually spent the majority of our time in our retreat going over several of these things that were brought up. So I'm going to jump into this with both feet. Many of you already have a copy that's on Friday when I'm putting this together. Our meeting will be a week from Sunday. There are other copies here. If you do not have one, you can contact me. I can email you everything. That's no problem at all. I want everybody to be familiar. Thank you for everyone who's already signed up to be a part of our Thanksgiving feast and to be there for the meeting so we can discuss this further. We will still take questions at the meeting. There will still take questions between now and the meeting. So please feel free to put comments below, or email, or contact, or call, or just come and see us. So your comments are always welcome. So as I said, I'm going to try to jump into this. I'm going to throw some slides up here. This first slide is a copy of what we have determined, or what we've called, for lack of a better name, a doctrinal addendum. And this will go in right at the end of the points that we already have in our doctrinal statement. And we worked on these with the assumption, and you don't have to read this. I'm going to make these, give you a larger copy of these, break these down and talk about these here in a second. We worked on these because there were questions about them. And my original thought was, let's just pull these out of there. They're self-explanatory. They're covered in our doctrinal statement, but there were questions, and I think they were good questions. So because we had those good questions, we went back and we revisited these things, decided not to delete them all or delete most of them, change them around, decided to kind of change the form of them, and then we added a couple things which we'll talk about here in a second. So our first two here, and I'll make these bigger so we can see them. Our first two are pretty much what you're familiar with in the past. The first one is the Ordinance of Baptism, and you'll see that there's only one change that's been made, and that is we changed the word may to shall. Shall. We deleted the word shall and made it a may. We do not want to be forced by our bylaws to baptize someone, and this is a subjective evaluation. So no one's guaranteed at Lakeview Community Church that they will be baptized. The second one is the Lord's Supper, and there were some questions about this. I hope that our added text there in red suffices. I know there are there may be other things that we could have added here. It just becomes too wordy and too difficult at certain times. Well, let me read this first, and then I'll make a statement. It says, "Our communion is open to all who are part of Christ's body, as articulated in a statement of fundamental truths of faith, fundamental truth statement of faith, number 7." And that basically means we have open communion. That's pretty common among churches in our group, and I think we need to kind of have the mindset that regardless of what we put on paper, the guardians of this are going to be you and I, or you if I'm gone, or the generation after you if you're gone. The guardians of this, the protectors of this, these things can be changed at any time. And so the protectors of what's right and wrong and our understanding of them are going to have to be us. So with that in mind, we're making our best effort to do something here that's helpful and productive, but also gives us some clarity as we move forward. Let's see, the next two, I'll make this big here again so you can see it. Again, we were going to delete this entirely, but here's what we ended up with. It says, those parents who wish to confirm their commitment to raise their children in the fear of the Lord, and we have scriptures there, and honor God by remembering that they are a gift of God, those children, may present themselves before the congregation for prayer, accountability, and mutual support. And then we've added a scripture at the bottom. Once again, we left the word dedication, but we kind of changed the wording of this around. So we want this to be. This is not a confirmation. It's not an infant baptism. It is an opportunity for parents to come and ask God to help them raise their children. And it's an opportunity for extended family if they're so desire. And it is most certainly an opportunity for the entire fellowship to say, we will pray with you toward that end, and we will support you in what you do. Again, there's more that could be said about that. Let's look at it again, and we'll look at the next part. It says prayer for healing of the sick. Again, kind of maybe self-explanatory, but we left it in, and it says, but we did tweak it a little bit. It says prayer for the sick and troubled, with laying on of hands and anointing with oil. And again, that red is all additional. Shall be available as request is made to the elders and as need may require. And then Mark 16:18 and James 5:14. So once again, that's very similar to what we had, but again, we tweaked it and made it to be something we thought would be more useful to us, more self-explanatory as we move forward. So I hope you're still with me. We've got a couple more of these to go. All right, so our next slide, where is it? Here it is. There we go. Our next slide is brand new. Now, these were in the papers that we handed to you this past week, but they were not in our original documents. And we wanted to give just a special thanks to the Evangelical Free Church. They had some of these things up on their website. And as we met as leaders, we kind of grabbed a couple different ones of them and pulled them together and combined some things that were there that we thought best expressed our sentiments and our belief on this. And as you know, the church is under assault. And these last two deal with doctrinal issues, and they also deal with church structure issues and how we run things and how we understand things. So we wanted this to be a statement that would give everybody right up front an idea of where we stand. Some may not like it. We believe this is a scriptural thing. So let me pop this up here and make it big, and we'll read it. It says marriage, and that's our topic. Since God created mankind in his own image, male and female, marriage is the exclusive covenantal union of one man and one woman as determined at birth, which union was designed by God and affirmed by Jesus. We will faithfully follow this scriptural definition of marriage in the teachings and practices of this church. And therefore, for example only, this church will not officiate, solemnize, perform, or host a marriage or marriage-like ceremony involving anything other than the union of one man with one woman as instituted by God. A civil governments or other churches' sanction of a union will be recognized as legitimate marriage by this church only to the extent that is consistent with this definition of marriage. All right, so it's pretty obvious what we've done here. I think we have defined marriage, and we have done that so that we have in our documents our system of belief, which at this point in this country is still considered sacred by the courts. This is we cannot violate our conscience. I have behind me on the wall, I have pictures of William Penn, and because it's important, because one of the bases of English common law was man's responsibility to his God and him being able to serve God according to his conscience and live for God according to his conscience. So that's still fundamental. And so putting this in our doctrinal statement allows us to say, no, we don't do that. We don't believe that. We're not going to change that. So that's about marriage. One man, one woman, their sex determined at birth. It's exclusively one man and one woman, and without getting into all sorts of weirdness. As you know, there's all sorts of weirdness out there. Excuse me. But what we're trying to do is define that. So that's what that's all about. Now, we've got one more, and then we'll move on to something entirely different. So let me pop this one up here, make it big for you to see it. Race. Interesting. They're making a statement about race. Yes. It says, since, according to the Bible, there is only one race, artificial divisions based upon skin color, ethnicity, culture, economic strata, etc., are unbiblical and unnecessary and divisive to the body of Christ, and should not be tolerated among believers. And then we have Romans 16, 17 through 18, and Galatians 5, 19 through 20. And I'm going to ask, let's see if I can find this here real quick. I'm going to ask that when we finally do this, that we add these verses from Titus chapter 3. We just read these here just a week or so ago. Let me read to you what they say. Verse 9 of chapter 3 of the book of Titus. But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies. That's interesting, isn't it? Avoid those genealogies. Dissensions and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned. So I'm going to ask, that's not in your documents, that's not on this slide, but I'm going to ask that that be added, and we'll make some adjustments for that for when we do our final vote on the 28th. You say, what does this have to do with? This has to do with critical race theory or critical theory. And interestingly enough, as a group of leaders, we just finished this book. Let's see if I can get this here in front of the camera. There we go. Called Woke Free Church. And it deals with critical race theory and its tentacles reaching into the evangelical church. This book specifically deals with critical race theory and the evangelical free church. So this was written by an evangelical free church pastor and calling into account some well-known leaders that you would know, and where are they? So I want to make a statement about that, because we're going to get this book and where is it? There you go. And make it available to you for a fee. You know, we'll charge you what we have to pay for them, unless you can't afford it, and then you can have it. But this doctrine is being discussed out here in the church, and it's not settled. And there are people who are calling it out, and there are other people who are responding, and there is debate going back and forth. There's going to be continued debate over months. It's not going to end tomorrow or the day after. And but it is books like this that help us get an understanding of what's going on. And we want to make sure that if we have such doctrine in our congregation, we can point to it and say, that's divisive. And we will ask people when they become members, what do you believe about this? One of the things that our leaders brought up is that there are now local congregations that have been taken over by people with, again, I'm grabbing this book, by people that have what I and what we as the leader group believe to be an unbiblical understanding of humanity and economics and political structures and the role of God and how do you interpret the Bible, and all of that is found in critical theory or critical race theory. So we're drawing a line in the sand, basically, is what we're doing. Again, send in your questions. Those were the things that are the main things. I have a few more things I need to talk to you about just briefly. So please hang on with me. I know it's been 15 minutes, but we'll try to get this done here in just a few more minutes. But there was one other question that I wanted to address. Let me get to this final slide here, if I can. I got one more slide. And that has to do with the E-Free's decision to remove the word premillennial from their doctrinal statement. The E-Free Church tried to do this before 2010, and they could not do it. They came back about 10 years later and was able to get that removed from the doctrinal statement through the process, and I don't even really know what that process is, through the leadership and then so on and so forth. But the only way they were allowed to do it was because they did not require that folks who held that position change it. I mentioned in our earlier documents that one of the reasons in our earlier discussion, that one of the reasons it became an issue was because they were graduating seminary students who no longer believed in the premillennial return of Christ. And it is an area of open discussion. And I'm going to go over it here briefly, not in detail. And I want to say to you that it is prophecy, and no prophecy is certain. But this is a bit disconcerting to me. I know there are a lot of us who are reading things, and we read all kinds of things, and over a period of time, our positions shift on things. I know over the years mine have shifted on certain things, and that's okay. We need to continually be asking questions and evaluating and reading and thinking about things. But let me give you 2 or 3 reasons why I think this should not be changed. Number one, I think we should be cautious about abandoning long-standing traditions. And frankly, when the E-Free Church changed this, they changed long-standing tradition. The founders of the E-Free Church were premillennialists, and this change, which couldn't happen 10 or so years ago, did happen now. Again, and I think I said this before, the seminaries no longer support it. So when pastoral candidates for ordination were quizzed by the board that examined them, they couldn't give wholehearted and unreserved support. And that's unfortunate. Now, as far as Lakeview is concerned, we only have 3 or 4 things that require wholehearted and unreserved support. And this is not one of them. So it's not vital, although it is important. And we'll talk about why. So I think we just need to be careful. And because the E-Free Church has done this and stirred all this up, I think when it came up, and I thought it's a relevant question, we need to ask it. And I have to bear some responsibility for maybe not talking about it enough. So And I'm not going to talk about it enough today because it's a huge topic, but we will try to at least scratch the surface for you. And this is not about setting dates or timing of prophecy or saying we understand all of prophecy. I certainly don't understand all of prophecy. But I do think that there are some things that we can say, and we'll say them here in just a moment. If you'll bear with me, we'll say them here in just a moment that will, I think, give us a greater understanding of exactly what's at stake with this. It's not about just a word. And if you guys decide you want to remove that word, we'll remove the word. I won't agree with it, but we'll remove the word. I'm just one vote in this thing. But I will still tell you why I don't think it is before then and after. I don't think it's a good thing before and after. So again, it's not about trying to figure out all of prophecy. So that's a couple things. The third thing I want to say about this is historically, if you look, you'll find that up until the 4th century, so we're talking more than 300 years after the ministry of Christ, the resurrection and the ascension, and it was a dominant theory. As a matter of fact, for the first couple hundred years, we have no writings of anyone who was not premillennial. They all believed in I don't want to use the word repeatedly here, a literal period of time, 1,000 years probably, period of time where Jesus Christ ruled and reigned from this earth, and they looked forward to it. So it changed. All of that began to change when persecution ended. And now this church was accepted, and it became a world conqueror. And the idea of a world conquering church replaced that persecuted church that was looking for a king that was going to set things right. Now we have a church that's going to change the world. And as I read these definitions here in just a minute, you're going to see that world they wanted to change was not an inner spiritual kingdom, but a worldly kingdom. So history, I believe, is on the side of premillennialism, and for 1,000 years, the doctrine was, for the most part, buried and then reemerged when we began to look at Scripture literally again in the 1500s. I'll let you put names and places and times to all of that. Now, let me give you some scriptural reasons. Number one, there are promises to Israel that, you know what? Let me before I do that, let me read to you a definition, and I'm going to read to you here out of my Bible. Ooh, it's notes. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I want to read you some notes that are here. Excuse me. That articulate the three main ways of looking at this 1,000 years. It says these verses are among them. We're dealing with Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6. These verses are among the most controversial in Revelation. Responsible scholars disagree regarding the meaning of the 1,000 years. The three main views are represented by one, premillennialists, those who believe Christ will return pre or before the millennium, think that this 1,000 years, which is Latin, in Latin is millennium, is a future time of great peace and justice, which is usually thought to be a literal 1,000-year period that will begin with when Christ returns to reign on earth as a physically present king, and which will include resurrected believers reigning with him. The second view is post-millennialists, those who believe that Christ will return post or after the millennial period, think that before Christ returns to earth, the gospel will spread and triumph so powerfully that societies will be transformed and peace and justice will reign on earth for 1,000 years or for a long period of time, after which Christ will return for the final judgment. And then 3, amillennialists, those who hold a non-literal millennial view, think this 1,000 years is the same period as the present church age, and that there will be no future millennium before Christ returns for the final judgment. Related to this is the question of whether the 1,000 years are to be interpreted literally. Most premillennialists hold this view, or symbolically. Most postmillennialists and amillennialists and some premillennialists hold this view. Those holding each view read John's millennial vision in terms of their understanding of other biblical texts. Now, that's an important point because there are other texts involved in this. And their approach to prophetic literature as a whole, and that is also an important point. Likewise, each of these views falls within the framework of historic Christian orthodoxy. So what he's saying there is that down through the years, this disagreement has not been considered something that casts someone out as a heretic, although there have been some firebrands who have, I guess there always are, if you don't agree with him about anything, you're a heretic. All right, so those are the 3 views: premillennialists, postmillennialists, and amillennialists. So let me give you the problems with post and awe, postmillennialism and amillennialism. And let me tell you why I'm a premillennialism. Number one, God made promises to Israel that I believe are yet unfulfilled. I do not believe that Israel and the church are melded together, which is what you have to believe if you're an amillennialist. Jesus was rejected by his people. He came into his own, and his own received him not. And in so doing, a new sort of kingdom was started, something that was a mystery that Paul in his epistles revealed to us. And then Paul also tells us in Romans 9 through 11, and again, this is very brief, but he tells us in those chapters that the Jews have been broken off, and this foreign plant has been grafted in, and that's the church. And there are other scriptures that relate to this, but I believe that there are promises to Israel that about their king, and the second one is, we'll talk about that, and it leads us to the second one, but there are promises about their king that have yet to be fulfilled. The second thing is, it goes right along and kind of follows right on the heels of that, touches the hem of the garment, so to speak, that there is a kingdom of peace. I believe a literal kingdom of peace that will be ruled by Jesus with, if I can use the term, a rod of iron, a sword that proceeds from his mouth, and he will rule from this earth. And all of the nations will come and will bring him tribute, and they will recognize him as the ruler, the legitimate ruler and king of all kings. All kingdoms will bow before him. And you can read Isaiah 65, Isaiah 11, Psalm 72, Zechariah 14. You can even read a few verses in 1 Corinthians 15. And they all point to a future kingdom. And this is not now. There's no way. If you're going to be an amillennialist, you have to be a contortionist with Scripture in order to make the things that have happened in the past 2,000 years be part of this kingdom. If you're a post-millennialist, you have to have a very aggrandized view of what the Church of Jesus Christ is doing that's going to bring in this kingdom of peace that Jesus will come. We're not producing that, and nor do we see this thing happening now. We don't see that kingdom happening now. We don't see a lion lying down with a lamb. We don't see the young not dying, people not dying until they're old, and safety and all of the things that are promised. And I believe those are literal promises. And that brings me to the third and major point of all of this. I do not believe you can read the book of the Revelation without prejudging and come to some of the convoluted theories that our theologians have come to. I believe that this book is chronological, and I believe it can be taken literally. In those few verses, 1,000 years is used 6 times. Isn't that interesting? And, you know, there's an interesting thing about 1,000 years. It has a beginning and it has an end. And that shows a chronology. And the whole book shows a chronology of moving from one place to the next in time, that is, and of moving to the end. And the book is the end. And so much so that when the Apostle John saw all that was going to happen, he said, "Come quickly." He wanted it to reach its culmination, to its climax. We know that Satan is bound for 1,000 years, and when he's done, now think with me, he's arrested, so to speak. He's incarcerated for 1,000 years, and he cannot deceive the nations, and then he's loosed. That whole process is a chronology that starts at a point and ends at another point. And we've got folks spiritualizing this and saying that that's not really what it means, that it's not literal, that it's metaphorical for something else. So I just want to challenge you as you look through this. And again, my greatest concern is that, not the word premillennial. My greatest concern is for those who've stopped reading the Bible literally. In Revelation chapter 1, that's the book we're in. Here's the command given to John. "Write therefore the things that you have seen," that's past, "things that are," that's present, "and the things that are to come," or that will take place after this, and that's future. That sets up a chronology. John then writes his letters to the 7 churches. And again, I'm going very quickly here. Chapter 4, verse 1, John says, "after this." And that phrase is used over and over and over again. In chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "Then I saw." And by the way, he moves toward chapter 6, and we see 7 seals. And there's a first seal, and a second seal, and a third seal, and a fourth seal, and a fifth seal. And, well, there's 7, aren't there? So 7 seals. You start and you end. There is a chronology there. And in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, "after this," once again. In chapter 8, verse 1, and I'm just, again, jumping on just the very tips of some of these things that you guys can study more if you want. It says, when the Lamb opened the 7th seal." You cannot read that sentence with an open mind and not realize that something has happened before this, and now something is going to happen because of this. There's a chronology that's going along here. And guess what? Out of that 7th seal came 7 trumpets, and they went in sequential order. And I'm not going to go through all of this with you now. It's in chapter 11. Again, I'm skipping along very quickly. It says, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff." And so, once again, there's this passage of time. There's this sequence of going, and John's going through these events. It appears that he's going through these events from here to here, and time is elapsing, however that looks in eternity. But as far as his understanding of time is elapsing, and he's going from one place to the next. And again, we see the trumpets in chapter 15 of that chapter 11, it says the seventh angel blew his trumpet. So we get to the end of that. When we get into chapter 13, again, I know that I'm skipping along. We see measurements begin of 42 months. And we know, if you know prophecy at all, you know about the 3.5 years, so on and so forth. In verse 11 of chapter 13, he says, then I saw another beast. Now, again, folks, think with me. There was a beast, and now there's another. And that all speaks to sequentialism. You've got something happening after another. And then the word then, chapter 14, he says then, verse 1, verse 6, then, verse 14, then I looked. Chapter 15, verse 1, then I saw. And then we see these bowls of God's wrath, one after another. And as we get to the end, we see this climactic end of these, of what some people refer to the tribulation and the great tribulation. And folks, we're not even talking about that. We're not talking about when that starts or when that ends or where the church is involved in any of that. We're not talking about any of that. All we're talking about is there a literal beginning and end to this book. Some Bible scholars believe that these chapters in sequence describe the same thing over and over again, one layered on top of another. So certain chapters describe these events, and then the next few chapters describe the same events, and the final few chapters describe the same events again. Well, I've read these events, and you can't do that with them. I don't know what's going on. As I mentioned earlier, in order to believe some of these things, you have to be a contortionist. Say, well, is 1,000 years 1,000 years? I don't know. I tend to think it is because it says 1,000. I believe a day is a day. I believe an evening and a morning, as Genesis says, is a day. And that evening and the morning was 24 hours. I'm a literalist as far as creation is concerned. I don't believe the earth was made over millions of years. I don't believe there was some indeterminable time in between these, that there was one day and the next day, and at the end of those days, God rested. My biggest trouble with what the EFCA has done is, as I mentioned in my message, they've let the tail wag the dog. And a handful of theologians who no longer read the book of the Revelation literally, as was done for the first few hundred years of the church, as was done when that denomination was started. They've decided that they know better. Maybe they do, but they haven't convinced me. All right. That's the best I can do. It's Friday. It's been a long week, and I used up most of my brain cells earlier in the week. So I hope this is some help. I'm praying that God will give us all wisdom and grace, and that we will know His direction. Once again, please don't hesitate with your questions or put your comments below. If you've got a question, you can stick that below. If you got a personal thing, you can Marco Polo me. You can email me. You can text me. But if it requires any lengthy answer, I will not be texting you back. My thumbs don't work that well. So God bless. I hope to see everyone on Sunday. Stay well. Be wise. Be fearless. Be faithful. God bless.